The mountain was quiet. October 7, 1780. Somewhere in the Carolina backcountry, a British officer stood atop a rocky ridge. He believed he had found the perfect defensive position. High ground. Visibility. A natural fortress. Major Patrick Ferguson had spent weeks hunting scattered rebels. He had threatened to march across the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay waste to their settlements. He was a professional soldier, a brilliant tactician, the finest marksman in the British Army. And he had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. Because beyond the mountain, beyond the Blue Ridge, beyond the frontier settlements, hundreds of men were moving. Not soldiers, not regulars. Farmers, hunters, frontiersmen. Men who had crossed some of the most difficult terrain in North America through snow and icy rivers and mountain passes to find one man, Patrick Ferguson. The British believed they were close to crushing the American Revolution in the South. But before the day was over, Ferguson would be dead, his Loyalist force would be destroyed, and Britain's southern strategy would suffer the first devastating blow in a chain of defeats that would ultimately lead to Yorktown. This is the story of how the hunter became the hunted. The year is 1780. The American Revolution is in its 5th year, and it is not going well. In the North, the war has ground into a bloody stalemate. But in the South, the British have unleashed a new strategy. They believe that by capturing southern cities, mobilizing Loyalist support, and crushing Patriot resistance, they can break the rebellion. The plan is bold. The early results are devastating. Charleston has fallen. Thousands of American soldiers are prisoners. The Continental Army in the South has been shattered. Lord Cornwallis, the British commander, is advancing through the Carolinas, confident that victory is within reach. The Patriot cause appears to be collapsing. But there is a problem. The British can capture cities. They can defeat armies. But controlling the enormous southern backcountry, that is something else entirely. Here, in the frontier settlements west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, men are watching, listening. And they are beginning to realize that this war is coming for them. Britain's southern strategy was born of necessity and opportunity. After France formally allied with the American colonies in 1778, Great Britain was forced to fight a global war. The British Army could no longer commit unlimited resources to North America. If Britain was going to win, it needed to find a more efficient way. The strategy was simple in concept. Capture the southern colonies, which were believed to have strong Loyalist populations, mobilize those Loyalists as militia, and crush the rebellion from the inside. Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, wrote that the southern plan would allow Britain to possess the country, at least the great proportion of it, without the risk of many men. The theory made sense on paper. The South had many colonists who remained loyal to the crown. Planters, merchants, officials, and professionals feared what independence might bring. They believed Britain offered order, protection, and stability. The British thought these Loyalists would rise en masse to support the Royal Army. But there was a fundamental miscalculation. Britain could occupy cities, it could march armies across the countryside, but it could not easily convert occupation into control. And nowhere was this more true than in the rugged frontier settlements of the American backcountry. Charleston was the most important port in the South. Its capture had been a British objective for years. In the spring of 1780, Sir Henry Clinton led an expedition that laid siege to the city. The results were catastrophic for the Patriot cause. Charleston surrendered on May 12th. Over 5,000 American soldiers were captured. It was one of the worst defeats of the entire Revolution. The entire Southern Army was gone. "We have lost an army," wrote one Patriot officer. "The Southern states are conquered." Thomas Jefferson later recalled the despair that gripped the region. "The whole country," he wrote, "was thrown into the deepest distress." The British victory created momentum. It created confidence, and it created overconfidence. Lord Cornwallis took command of British forces in the South, and he was determined to press the advantage. In August 1780, he delivered another crushing defeat to American forces at the Battle of Camden. The Patriot cause in the South seemed finished. But the British victories had unintended consequences. As the Royal Army advanced, it began to encounter resistance not from the remnants of the Continental Army, but from something far more difficult to defeat: a civilian population that refused to accept British rule. The British plan relied on recruiting American colonists to fight on the Crown's behalf. These Loyalists would secure towns, protect supply lines, and suppress Patriot resistance. They would allow the British Army to move forward without leaving large garrisons behind. But the Southern campaign was becoming something else entirely. It was becoming a civil war. Patriots fought Loyalists. Neighbors fought neighbors. Families were divided. Communities fractured. The conflict became personal, brutal, vengeful, and increasingly savage. The British strategy in the South depended on Loyalist support, one historian notes. But the reliance on Loyalists created a conflict that was as much about local grievances as about the larger revolution. This was the environment in which Patrick Ferguson would operate, a competent British officer, a Loyalist organizer, and a man who would dramatically underestimate the enemy he was provoking. Cornwallis could not occupy the entire countryside with British regulars. His army was too small, the territory too vast. He needed local support. That meant Loyalist militia. Major Patrick Ferguson was, by any measure, an impressive officer. A Scotsman from a noble family, Ferguson had served with distinction in the British Army. He was a brilliant tactician and a gifted marksman. He had invented a breech-loading rifle that bore his name, a weapon so advanced that it allowed him to fire 6 shots a minute. He was tough, aggressive, and confident. He was also, by the standards of the British Army, an innovator. Ferguson understood the importance of light infantry. He knew that victory in the southern backcountry would require mobility, initiative, and adaptation. Nicknamed Bulldog by his men, Ferguson was sent west to recruit Loyalist militia and protect Cornwallis's left flank during the advance into North Carolina. He was remarkably successful at first. He gathered hundreds of Loyalist recruits, dispersed Patriot militia bands, and seemed to be restoring British control to the Carolina backcountry. But Ferguson had a blind spot. He viewed the Patriot settlers of the frontier as backwater men and the dregs of mankind. He believed they were scattered, disorganized, and incapable of mounting serious resistance. He had no idea that these very qualities, their independence, their marksmanship, their familiarity with the terrain, would become his undoing. Who were these over-mountain men who would ultimately destroy Ferguson's force? They were settlers from Virginia, North Carolina, and the frontier settlements that would later become Tennessee. They lived west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, in valleys carved by the Watauga, Holston, and Nolichucky rivers. They were Scots-Irish, German, and English. They were farmers, hunters, and frontiersmen who had carved out homesteads in some of the most difficult terrain on the continent. They were also, by necessity, skilled fighters. Life on the frontier meant constant vigilance. The men who settled these valleys knew how to use rifles. They knew how to move through mountains. They understood woodcraft, tracking, and guerrilla warfare. They had fought Native American tribes and learned the art of fighting in small bands, using cover, and striking from ambush. These men were not soldiers. They had no uniforms, no formal training, no chain of command. They elected their own officers and served as volunteers. But they had something that the British military did not fully appreciate, a deep personal stake in the outcome of the conflict. The revolution was not an abstract political struggle for them. It was about defending their homes, their families, and their way of life. What transformed these scattered frontier settlers into a determined army was a single threat. From his base at Gilberttown, North Carolina, Ferguson issued a chilling proclamation. He sent a prisoner into the backcountry with a message for the men across the mountains. If you do not desist from your opposition to the British arms, I shall march this army over the mountains, hang your leaders, and lay waste your country with fire and sword. Ferguson believed this threat would intimidate the settlers. It would force them to submit to British authority or abandon their homes. The threat was designed to end resistance. It did the exact opposite. The threat did not stop resistance. It intensified it. The frontier patriots now had a common enemy. They were no longer fighting for an abstract cause. They were fighting to protect their families and their land. A hunter had just made himself the hunted. In the frontier settlements, the reaction was immediate. Isaac Shelby, a militia colonel from the Holston Valley, received word of Ferguson's threat and rode 40 miles to the home of John Sevier. The two men discussed the situation. They realized that they had a choice: wait for Ferguson to invade their homeland, or cross the mountains on their own terms and attack him. They chose to attack. The call went out. Express riders carried messages to settlements across Virginia, North Carolina, and the frontier. The men were to assemble at Sycamore Shoals, on the banks of the Watauga River. They would cross the mountains and find Patrick Ferguson. The response was astonishing. On September 25, 1780, men began arriving. They brought their own horses and their own rifles. They wore their own clothes, homespun and buckskin. They were not an army. They were a gathering of individuals, each determined to stop the man who had threatened their families. William Campbell brought 400 Virginians. Shelby brought 240. Sevier brought a like number. Colonel MacDowell's men, who had been harassing Ferguson for weeks, arrived as well. Benjamin Cleveland and Joseph Winston brought more men from North Carolina. Before the muster was complete, nearly 1,000 men had assembled at Sycamore Shoals. On September 26, 1780, the Over-Mountain men began their march. They followed a trail called Bright's Trace, a path originally worn by bison and later used by Native Americans and settlers. They crossed Yellow Mountain, the highest point on the route, elevation nearly 5,000 feet. At the summit, they found snow shoe-mouth deep. They descended into freezing streams that cut through their shoes. The men ate one hot meal a day. They slept under rocks, in hollow trees, wherever they could find shelter. Over the next 2 weeks, they would march more than 200 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in the Appalachian Mountains. This was not a conventional army. There were no supply wagons, no tents, no commissary. Each man carried his own provisions and ammunition. They had one objective: find Ferguson before he found them. The journey was brutal, but the men were determined. They had received 500 pounds of gunpowder from Mary Patton, a frontier woman who manufactured it at her own powder mill. They had been inspired by the words of Reverend Samuel Doak, who preached about Gideon and his small force defeating a much larger army. Now they were going to war. 2 men from Sevier's command had deserted. They had ridden ahead to warn Ferguson that a massive militia force was coming over the mountains. Ferguson immediately understood his danger. His position had suddenly become desperate. The men he had dismissed as rebels were now an army pursuing him. He sent a message to Cornwallis, requesting reinforcements. 300 or 400 good soldiers, part dragoons, would finish the business. Then he began to retreat toward Charlotte, where Cornwallis was encamped. He hoped to find safety in the larger British army. But the Patriots were faster. The leaders of the militia knew they had to move quickly. Ferguson had a head start, but he was still within reach. On October 7, they selected the 900 best marksmen from their ranks, men mounted on the best horses, and set out to intercept him. They rode through the night. A cold rain began to fall. The men wrapped their hunting frocks around their rifles to keep the weapons dry. They rode without stopping, without eating, through a pitch-black October night that seemed to stretch forever. By dawn, they had crossed the broad river at Cherokee Ford. The rain had stopped. The sun was beginning to warm the ground, but the men were exhausted. Then they received word from scouts. Ferguson had stopped. He had chosen a defensible position on a rocky hill called King's Mountain. He believed he could make a stand there. He was about to discover how badly he had miscalculated. October 6, 1780, the night before the battle. Ferguson's Loyalist force, about 1,000 men, was encamped on King's Mountain, a 60-foot high ridge straddling the North Carolina-South Carolina border. The top of the mountain was a narrow, oblong clearing. The sides were wooded and rocky. Ferguson had chosen well. The high ground gave him a clear view of approaching enemies. The slopes were difficult to climb, especially for men carrying weapons and ammunition. A small force could hold the summit against a much larger attacking force. But Ferguson had not been able to prepare proper defensive positions. He had arrived only hours earlier. His men were tired, and the Patriot militia was moving faster than he expected. On the mountain, the Loyalists made what preparations they could. Campfires flickered. Men checked their weapons. A few hours of sleep before the dawn. Below the mountain, the Patriots were gathering. They had surrounded Ferguson's position, moving into position under the cover of darkness. They were close enough to hear the Loyalists' campfires crackling, close enough to see the glow of their torches. The mountain was quiet. No one knew how the battle would unfold, but everyone knew that tomorrow the war would come to the mountain. The afternoon of October 7, 1780, a cool, overcast day. The leaves were beginning to turn. The Patriot militia crept into position. Their leaders had devised a simple plan: surround the mountain and attack from all sides. This would prevent the Loyalists from massing their forces and force them to defend in multiple directions. Colonel William Campbell gave the order. According to one account, he told his men, "Shout like hell and fight like devils." The Patriots advanced. They did not march in European formations. They spread out, using the trees and rocks for cover. They moved like they were hunting, which, in a sense, they were. The Loyalists on the summit opened fire, but the British advantage, the high ground, was not as decisive as they had hoped. The Patriots were using the terrain to their advantage. They were Indian-style fighters, moving from cover to cover, firing their rifles with deadly accuracy. Within an hour, the Patriot forces had seized the southwestern summit. They were closing in from all sides. The Loyalists were being squeezed into a smaller and smaller area at the northeastern end of the ridge. The high ground had become a trap. Ferguson's Loyalists were being attacked from multiple directions. Every time they drove the Patriots back with a bayonet charge, the Patriots withdrew into the woods, only to return and attack from another angle. The terrain that Ferguson had chosen as a defensive position was now working against him. The rocky slopes and thick undergrowth provided perfect cover for the Patriot marksmen. The Loyalists, massed on the summit, were exposed. There was a rattling fire kept up from the woods by the enemy, one Loyalist later recalled. They were like devils from the infernal regions, tall, raw-boned, sinewy with long matted hair. The Patriot riflemen were remarkably accurate. The difference between a rifle and a musket became devastatingly clear. The Patriots' rifles could hit a target at 200 or 300 yards. The Loyalists' muskets were accurate only to about 100 yards. One Patriot soldier described the scene. The dead lay in heaps on all sides, while the groans of the wounded were heard in every direction. I could not help turning away from the scene before me, with horror, and though exulting in the victory, could not refrain from shedding tears. Ferguson knew he was losing control. Major Patrick Ferguson was a brave man. He could have retreated when he first learned of the approaching militia. He could have abandoned his position and tried to escape. Instead, he had chosen to stand and fight. Now the battle was going badly. Loyalist casualties were mounting. Ferguson's men were surrounded. The Patriots were closing in. Ferguson's staff urged him to retreat. He refused. According to some accounts, he called out, "Gentlemen, we must die like soldiers." He mounted his horse and led one last charge to break through the Patriot lines. It was a desperate gamble, and it was Ferguson's final act. Patriot riflemen immediately targeted the mounted British officer. Multiple shots hit him at once. He fell from his horse, his body tumbling to the ground. He may have died instantly, or he may have had a few moments to realize what had happened. Patrick Ferguson, the hunter of rebels, was dead. The moment Ferguson fell, the battle was effectively over. His Loyalists were leaderless, surrounded, and taking heavy casualties. Within minutes, Loyalist officers raised a white flag of surrender. The fighting stopped. The Patriots secured the battlefield. They counted their dead. 29 killed, 62 wounded. The Loyalist losses were much heavier. 157 killed, 163 wounded, and 698 captured. The victory was decisive. A Loyalist force of more than 1,000 men had been destroyed. Its commander was dead. The Loyalist cause in the South had suffered a devastating blow. But this was not an honorable surrender. The Patriots had been fighting for weeks. They had seen their homes threatened and their families endangered. Many of the Loyalists had committed atrocities in the preceding months. Resentment ran high. In the days after the battle, Patriot leaders tried and executed 9 Loyalist prisoners, a dark aftermath to a pivotal victory. The Civil War nature of the conflict was clear. This was not simply an American army defeating a British one. It was a conflict between divided neighbors. The impact of Kings Mountain was immediate and profound. Patrick Ferguson was one of Britain's most capable officers. His death was a severe blow. The Loyalist militia he had organized and trained was destroyed. Cornwallis had lost his western flank, leaving the British Army vulnerable to attack from the backcountry. The British commander, Lord Cornwallis, was forced to reassess his strategic position. He abandoned his advance into North Carolina and retreated to a winter encampment in South Carolina. The momentum that had seemed so unstoppable just weeks earlier had been broken. The Patriot cause, which had appeared close to collapse, experienced a dramatic revival. Thomas Jefferson later wrote that Kings Mountain was the turn of the tide of success. Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander, called it the first link in a chain of evils that followed each other in regular succession until they at last ended in the total loss of America. George Washington himself praised the achievement of the Over-Mountain Men. The crude, spirited, hardy, determined volunteers who crossed the mountains served as proof of the spirit and resources of the country. Kings Mountain did not end the American Revolution, but it set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to British defeat. Cornwallis, having lost Ferguson and his Loyalist force, found his situation increasingly precarious. He faced a new American general, Nathaniel Greene, who understood that the British were vulnerable in the countryside. Greene divided his forces, forced the British to spread out, and avoided decisive defeats while wearing down the British Army. The battles that followed, Cowpens, Guilford Courthouse, Eutaw Springs, were part of a pattern that Kings Mountain had established. The British could win tactical victories, but they could not control the country. Every encounter cost them men and resources they could not replace. By the summer of 1781, Cornwallis's army had been drawn to the Virginia coast. Trapped between American and French forces, he surrendered at Yorktown. The American Revolution was won. Kings Mountain did not guarantee American independence, but it demonstrated that British victory in the South was not inevitable. It proved that the Revolution was alive, and that the men of the frontier were not willing to surrender. The Battle of Kings Mountain has been mythologized. The reality is more complex and more interesting. The popular image of backwoods sharpshooters defeating British regulars is not quite accurate. The battle was fought almost entirely between Americans, Patriot militia versus Loyalist militia. Patrick Ferguson was the only British soldier on the battlefield. The Patriots were not just untrained farmers. They were experienced fighters. They had elected capable leaders. They had a clear plan and executed it effectively. Their victory owed as much to their commander's tactical decisions as to their marksmanship. The Loyalists were not incompetent. They were well-trained and fought bravely. But their position on the mountain, which seemed like a defensive advantage, became a trap. The Patriots' ability to attack from multiple directions ultimately overwhelmed them. Finally, the victory was not guaranteed. It could easily have been a Patriot defeat. But the combination of effective leadership, tactical flexibility, and sheer determination gave the over-mountain men the advantage. Why does this battle matter? Why, after more than 200 years, should we remember what happened on a rocky hill in the Carolina backcountry? Because Kings Mountain was the moment when British confidence in the Southern strategy collided with the reality of a revolution that had spread deep into the American backcountry. Kings Mountain destroyed a significant Loyalist force. It killed Patrick Ferguson. It damaged British morale and revived Patriot spirits. It complicated Cornwallis's strategic situation and revealed the limits of relying on Loyalist support. But more importantly, Kings Mountain showed that the revolution was not just about famous generals and formal armies. It was about ordinary people, farmers, hunters, frontiersmen, who refused to accept British rule. The British could occupy cities. They could defeat armies, but they could not easily conquer the people living beyond them. Kings Mountain was proof that the American Revolution was alive in the hearts of the people, and that it would not be defeated. October 7, 1780. The British officer believed he was hunting rebels. The rebels were hunting him. Ferguson chose the high ground. The Patriots surrounded it. He tried to hold the mountain. The mountain became his trap. Patrick Ferguson, who had threatened to march across the mountains and lay waste to the frontier, fell dead on a rocky ridge. His Loyalist army was captured or killed. Cornwallis's southern strategy suffered a blow from which it never recovered. Kings Mountain did not end the war. It did not guarantee American independence. But it proved that British victory in the South was not inevitable. The Revolution was still alive. And it survived because of men like those who crossed the mountains to find Patrick Ferguson. Men who were not soldiers, not regulars, not professionals. Men who were farmers and hunters. Men who had homes to protect and families to defend. Men who refused to surrender to a king. The American Revolution did not succeed because of famous generals and formal armies alone. It succeeded because ordinary people in the backcountry and across the colonies refused to accept defeat. Kings Mountain was their victory, and it was the beginning of the end for the British Empire in America.